As soon as the things had arrived, we took care of assembling his bed. The table was placed in the middle of the room with a rug. It was to serve as desk and dining room table, just as the room itself was to be bedroom, study, and dining room. It was impossible to be more confined than the emperor was, but he was free to move about, and the rest could be forgotten. A dresser was offered to me with so much insistence on Mr. Balcomb's part that I had to accept. I spread out on it the emperor's travel kit, which once opened decorated the room a little. I sent for a crate from town containing the silver washstand taken from the Élysée Bourbon, work of the silversmith Binet. This piece of silver was very elegant, had cost 10,000 francs, and was the source of the Balcombe family's admiration. Portraits of the King of Rome and Empress Marie-Louise were hung on the wall, and a few pieces of cloth stretched on ropes across the windows completed the furnishings of the room. Count de la Casas settled in with his son upstairs. Saint-Denis, Novaras, and I slept in the hallway, wrapped in our coats on field mattresses that were sent from town. It was there that the master of the world, abandoned to his fate, was to reside for 2 months. He would have to wait for his intended house, located in the most sterile portion of the island, to be finished. Faced with such great misfortune, we understood that the time for self-denial had arrived. We did not fail in this. We took care of everything, and the emperor was served in St. Helena with the same zeal, the same care, and the same attentiveness as at the Tuileries in the time of his splendor. Nothing was too much for us to achieve this end, the single and only goal of our desires, happy to prove to him such a well-deserved devotion at any price. Artillery captain greatly moved into the Briars with the 2 orderlies to keep an eye on the emperor. But no matter how much care he took to avoid being the emperor's way, he always was, and this had unfortunate results. It characterized the beginning of the faltering of relations between the admiral and the emperor. The dinner came from town, brought by Cipriani, the next day's luncheon being made up of part of the previous night's dinner. It was evident that the emperor would live very poorly in this arrangement. Count de la Casas and his son had to do without napkins the first day, as the table linen had not yet arrived. Everything that was brought from town to the Briars by slaves arrived cold. The emperor did not complain the first days, blaming the poor dinners on awkward organization. However, he talked to me about it one evening as he was going to bed. I told him he had a butler and a pantry head in town. One of the 2 could be with him and do his cooking at the Briars, and without disturbing Mrs. Balcombe. It would be possible to use to good advantage a small room where the slaves cooked their food. This way he could have a hot dinner. 2 days later, Pierron, the pantry head, and Lepage, the cook, came on orders of Count de Montholon, whom the emperor put in charge of the service of the Grand Marshal, and they moved into the Briars. The silver and linen also arrived in sufficient quantity. The service for the emperor's table took on a regularity it had heretofore lacked. In town, Cipriani was put in charge of provisions for the Briars, where they arrived every morning, and of providing for the officers lodged with their families in town. He kept with them the 2 Archambault brothers, Gentilini and Rousseau, and Santini, for serving at the table. Admiral Cockburn, attempting to maintain the rapport that had been established between himself and the emperor on the Northumberland, came from time to time to the Briars to offer his good services. But the surveillance measures taken by his officer, considered by the emperor vexations and totally useless, were weakening this rapport rather than strengthening it. Since the establishment of the kitchen at Longwood, the emperor, when one of his officers came from town, could keep him for dinner and have him nearby longer. Thus he managed not to have a day go by without seeing them. In his solitude, the emperor kept the habits he had acquired on board ship. He would remain in his room until 4 o'clock, dress, and followed by Count de la Casas, go into the garden to wait for the moment when he was informed that dinner was served. General Bingham, coming one morning to pay a visit to the emperor, exclaimed over the cramped conditions of his lodging, and offered to send him a tent that could be erected in front of the pavilion on a piece of land leveled for this purpose. This tent became the dining room and the study, and was of great use during our stay at the Briars. Finally, after such a long crossing and such great misfortune, the emperor seemed to appreciate the calmness of the deep solitude that surrounded him. He did not seem to notice the privations from which he suffered, and passed long hours of boredom in conversations with Count Lacasis on the Italian campaigns which he was dictating to him. The Balcombe cottage sheltered the head of the family who had gout, Mrs. Balcombe, kind, sweet, and affectionate, and two young ladies, of whom the younger, Miss Betsy, promised to become pretty. Both of them were pleasant and gracious. They spoke a little French. As Count de Lacasis spoke perfect English, relations were established with this family. The emperor sometimes went to their house to be amused by the naivete of these young people and to partake in a game of whist that they offered him. He was moved by the great care this family took in offering their services and would have gone there more often had he not noticed that curiosity brought to this house a few people desiring to see him. I have said that an artillery captain, Mr. Greatley, a sergeant, and a few soldiers had moved into the Briars and were carrying on a wearisome surveillance. After remarks were made to the admiral, the sergeant and the soldiers were taken away, but the captain continued to stay in civilian clothes. The surveillance did not remain any less active, although it was disguised. In town, it continued to take place with the same rigor. These gentlemen could not take one step without being followed by an officer or a sergeant. It was the same when they came to the Briars to see the emperor, and even the ladies noticed it. Although all of them were better lodged than the emperor, who had left them his butler, he felt isolated. The ladies came to dinner on Sunday expressing their sorrow, and the men talked to him about the harassment this meticulous surveillance was causing him. The emperor sympathized with their complaints deeply, urged them to be patient, and promised that a good family life would offset the annoyances that they were suffering as soon as they were established at Longwood. Count de Lacasis' position was envied by all, and with reason. An intimacy based on witty conversation and a very courteous nature was forming between the emperor and himself, further strengthened by their similarity in ages. Those whose devotion had been demonstrated on the battlefield and whose love for him was no less great feared they would lose a part of this affection that was becoming their sole consolation on this miserable rock. Here they sought neither titles nor greatness, but a friendship whose worth everyone felt in this land of exile. Certainly I would not have exchanged my shipboard mattress, though I felt the floor through it, for the most comfortable bed in the Porteous household. The emperor knew the best way to fight boredom was work. To this end, he arranged to have one of these gentlemen every day. I have said that the Italian campaigns were dictated to Count de Lacasis, those of Egypt to the Grand Marshal. General Gourgaud had the consulate, the island of Elba and the 100 Days, Count de Montallon, and the Empire, and, as if it were necessary to have two people to copy and clean up all these dictations, once corrected, the emperor found nothing better than to put Saint-Denis and myself in charge. Later, when the emperor had me write under his dictation, Saint-Denis found himself alone in this work. The emperor had tried to write himself, but his hand could not follow his thoughts that were so quick, so concise, and full of fire. His fingers did not respond to the speed of his imagination. Then he attempted abbreviating, but in such a fashion that it was illegible to everyone, and sometimes even to himself. Confused one day by a few words inserted between two lines, I went to show it to him so he could read them to me. He was unable to read them himself, and told me to leave them blank, commenting that he would remember them later. During our stay at the Briars, the admiral gave several balls and a great dinner party, and came to invite the emperor to do him the honor of attending. He attended on this occasion to introduce him unofficially the civil and military officers of the island. Such gatherings did not suit the emperor, who thanked him graciously for his invitation. These gentlemen and these ladies, even Mr. de Lacasis, in response to the emperor's wish, attended all these parties. A similar invitation was extended to the emperor a few days later by Colonel Bingham and Major Fearson. In the name of the officers who were giving the ball, the emperor thanked them, refused, and sent Count de Lacasis. The letter went out of obedience, saying he was led more by the desire to be able to give an account to the emperor of how the work was coming along at Longwood than by the attraction of a pleasure that was not meant for a man of his age. He took his son with him and came back exhausted during the night, The following day he spoke of the house and the work being done there in the words of a man who was not at all attracted by the house's location, nor the barrenness surrounding it. "Sire," he said, "here we are camped. There we shall be penned in." The emperor was beginning to tire of this prolonged stay at the Briars, going out in short breeches and silk stockings for walks in the garden after sundown. He had caught cold and was coughing a great deal. Mrs. Balcombe, to whose home he sometimes went toward the end of the evening, offered to make him an infusion of 4 flowers with a little honey from her own hives. The emperor thanked her and showed her a small candy box containing licorice, the only remedy he said that he wished to use. The emperor stayed at home for a few days, and the cold disappeared. One evening, when the weather was too bad for him to go out, he was sitting near a table with Count de Lacases and his son, and asked me to bring the box containing the snuff boxes. I brought it to him, open, revealing the first compartment. Count de Lacases and his son were not familiar with them. They marveled at the opulence of the boxes and the resemblance of the imperial family in the portraits, which they looked at, each in turn. "It is an evening with the family that I am giving you, my dear Las Casas," the emperor said to him. "I had a great many others that Constance stole from me at Fontainebleau in 1814. The boxes in the second compartment were no less beautiful. They were decorated with antique cameos, very rare gold and silver coins, paintings by Petitot, portraits by Turenne. After examining the contents of the box, and after Monsieur Emmanuel Las Casas had read to the emperor several Greek inscriptions around the medals decorating some of the snuff boxes, I was about to close the box when the emperor told me to also put in those he had been using since he was at the Briars. One was decorated with the portrait of Empress Marie-Louise, the other with that of the King of Rome. He replaced them with 2 others with silver medals. On one was the head of Caesar, and that of Timoleon. On the other, that of Alexander. "Come," he said, "don't you have anything more to show me? Show me my riches." I brought him another case containing 12 gold boxes with the imperial coat of arms, intended to give as presents, and 2 others decorated with his portrait surrounded by large diamonds. In the same box, there were 2 small spyglasses for wartime use. Having seen these objects, he asked me for one of his small field travel kits. He examined all of its pieces in front of Count de Lacases, and after closing it, gave it to him with these words: "It served me on the morning of Austerlitz, and shall go to Emmanuel when he is 30 or 40 years old." Since the emperor had been at the Briars, he had not attempted to extend his excursions beyond what he called his favorite path. One day he felt like riding on horseback, and covering an area of the island, horses were immediately sent from town. Monsieur de Lacases and Saint-Denis were getting ready to accompany him, but as he was about to mount his horse, the emperor learned that the duty horse officer, who the day before had allowed him to ride alone if he did not want to be accompanied by him, had just received orders to comply with his instructions. The emperor was irritated by this and told Saint-Denis to send the horses back. He would not be going out. After his dinner, he went out in the garden, as was customary, and roaming about, he spotted a small path used only by slaves. He set out down the path to reach the little valley seen from the windows of his pavilion. Although the path was dangerous, the emperor, Monsieur de Lacases, and his son followed it, and arrived, not without difficulty, at the house of Major Hudson, the aim of their stroll. When the emperor left the major, night had fallen. They could not come back by the same path and accepted the horses that were offered them. They arrived at the Briars quite late, which had kept us wondering where the emperor might have been, as he was neither in the garden nor at Mr. Balcombe's. The next day, the emperor was delighted by his previous night's excursion and spoke in very honorable terms of Major Hudson and the cordial welcome he had received. There was something behind this pleasure. It was to have deceived his guard, who could not imagine the emperor and Count de Las Casas attempting to follow such a dangerous path. Admiral Cockburn, in spite of the restrictions that he imposed, remained nevertheless full of consideration for the emperor and his retinue, and of courtesy for the ladies. But in town the surveillance had become intolerable due to the adoption of new measures that took these gentlemen by surprise and disturbed them in their daily routines. The following is an example. The Frenchmen who were not residing at the Briars were henceforth to be back in town before 9 p.m., lest they be arrested by sentries who had orders to prevent any traffic at that hour between Jamestown and the Briars. Here are the orders of the port authorities as they were communicated to the Emperor. Port regulations. 1. The commanders of the Honorable East India Company's ship and the masters or commanders of all merchant ships who are permitted to anchor at this island may not go ashore or allow anyone belonging to their vessel or ship to go ashore until these regulations have been communicated on board said ships. They must first send a list of all people on board to the governor so that he may indicate who is permitted to come ashore. 2. Firstly, it is required of all commanders of ships or vessels to declare whether any illness, contagious or otherwise, has taken place on the board ship, and whether there have been any deaths in the course of the voyage, and if so, to state the causes. 3. All letters and packages addressed to residents of the island, except those arriving by regular mail, must be given to the officer bearing these regulations. He will leave them with the government secretary, where the persons to whom they are addressed may come to claim them. 4. If the commander, one of his passengers, or anyone on board carries any letter, packages, etc., addressed to one of the foreigners on the island, they are requested to inform the governor himself, giving him the note or letter in its envelope or awaiting his orders, if the package is sizable. 5. Only the commander of the ship, once these regulations have been read and published on board, may come ashore if he wishes to go directly to the governor's, should he be in town. If not, he will make his arrival known as the quarters of the Deputy Chief of Staff. 6. The commanders, officers, and any passengers who are then permitted to debark will go at once to the office of the major in town to read and sign the island regulations before going to their lodgings or visiting any house or individual whatsoever. 7. No passenger or the person debarking from a vessel at the coast may leave Jamestown Valley without permission. To obtain permission, they must appear at the Deputy Chief of Staff's office. 8. No individual whatsoever having permission to debark may visit the Briars or Longwood or their adjacent boundaries, nor have any verbal or written communication with the foreigners detained on the island without having directly informed the governor of his intentions and receiving his authorization to do so. If any individual should receive a letter or package from said foreigners, he must immediately bring it to the governor before replying to it. The same rule applies to any packages that may be received or whose delivery is attempted. 9. The commanders of the East India Company vessels and the masters of all types of merchant ships who are permitted to anchor on the coast of the island may not allow anyone to go ashore or leave without the authorization of the governor. No passenger may sleep on shore without his knowledge. 10. No vessel belonging to the East India Company or any merchant ship may debark between sunrise and sunset, nor at any moment of the day whatsoever, without the officer in charge being present. If a ship, for any reason whatsoever, receives an order not to land, it must take care to stay at some distance from the harbor in order to allow other ships to land without interference. The greatest haste must be taken by ships loading or unloading merchandise to not obstruct the path of other ships. 11. All boats belonging to the East India Company or any merchant vessels must leave the island at sunset, and passengers must immediately return on board their respective vessels, except under circumstances designated by the admiral. 12. No boat belonging to the vessels of the East India Company or to any ship whatsoever may come alongside or send a boat to any other vessel arriving in the harbor. No boat may land anywhere except in the harbor. 13. No vessel of the East India Company or any merchant ship whatsoever may drop anchor at this island between sundown and sunrise, nor set sail after sundown or before 10 a.m. They must not set sail until the clearance flag has been raised for each vessel and ship. 14. If the clearance flag is raised for a vessel shortly before sunset and it does not weigh anchor quickly enough, it may not set sail until the signal has been repeated the following day at 10 a.m. 15. It is expressly forbidden to all commanders of vessels or merchant ships to allow any fishing boat of the island alongside his ship without a permit signed by the governor, or to allow any boat belonging to his vessel to approach the numbered craft of island fishermen or to communicate with them. 16. If a fishing boat seeks to communicate with a vessel heading for the island which is ready at anchor, or if it communicates with a boat belonging to the vessel, its commander or its officers are required to immediately make this known to the governor and the Deputy Chief of Staff, taking the boat's number and detaining it if circumstances so dictate. 17. The commanders of vessels carrying newspapers which may contain recent newsworthy of interest are required to give them to the person reading these regulations for the surveillance of the governor, who will then carefully return them. 18. It is forbidden to debark gunpowder without first having alerted the Commissioner of Supplies and the master attendant, so that all necessary precautions may be taken to prevent accidents. 19. No stallions, mares, or geldings may be debarked without permission from the government secretary. 20. No wine of any sort may be debarked without a permit from the government secretary. 21. As the Honorable Council of Directors has prohibited the importation of spirits coming from India, it is ordered that anyone in violation of this ordinance will pay a fine of £100 Brandy, mead, rum from the West Indies, cordials, etc. may only be debarked in very limited quantities, and after having obtained permission and paid a tax of 12 shillings per gallon, the debarking of any spirit in any quantity without a permit will subject the offender to the above-mentioned penalty. 22. Whaling vessels may not cast their harpoons while they are in the vicinity of the island, under penalty of a fine of £50. Half this sum will be given in reward to the person reporting the infraction. 23. All commanders of vessels or masters of merchant ships must announce their departure 48 hours in advance, and do the same if they wish to remain longer than the time agreed on. This announcement must be given in writing to the government secretary and to the master attendant between 10 a.m. and 2 p.m. The topsail must be lowered 48 hours prior to the vessel's departure. No commander or master of any vessel or ship whatsoever may leave any person on the island or take any person away under any pretext without having requested in writing permission from the governor. 24. No commander, passenger, or any person whatsoever on board one of the vessels of the Honorable East India Company or any other vessel that has anchored at the island may take possession of letters or packages to transport them to Europe, the Cape of Good Hope, South America, or anywhere else, except those arriving by post or which have been consigned to them by the Secretary or the Deputy Chief of Staff. The commander of the vessel or merchant ship is to sign the attached form and return it to the officer reading these regulations.